Okay, good morning. Just make sure this is on. Good morning. If I could have your attention, please. We'd like to go ahead and get this show started. Well, first off, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate this is a great turnout, and I really appreciate the interest that all of you have shown in being here. What we're going to do today is present the results from a weekend think tank where we brought together can you hear me now? So we can turn this. Can we increase the volume on the mic? Okay, this was a weekend event where we brought together a really remarkable group of people. On the one hand, we had a number of scholars, really leading scholars from around the world, on the topic of adolescent risk behavior, particularly from an evolutionary perspective. And in addition, we had excellent representation from the community. And we tried to put our heads together for a couple of days and think about what could an evolutionary perspective do in terms of helping us think more about prevention and policy for adolescents. Now, before I actually go into this program, I want to just recognize some of our distinguished guests that are here today. Particularly, we have here in the audience today people from the Arizona State Legislature, from the Pima County Schools, from the public library system, from the Pima County Attorney's Office, from Cooperative Extension. We have colleagues here from the Terry J. Lundgren Center, from Northern Arizona University, and a number of partners with local public health and community organizations. So again, this is really an amazing group of people that are here to hear this today, so I thank you again for being here. This presentation is really going to have two stages, and that is my colleague, David Sloan Wilson, is going to give a general introduction to really the use of evolutionary theory for thinking about, or evolutionary thinking for helping us better understand adolescence and human affairs, and then I'm going to present some results from the workshop. Okay, so David's going to start off, and David is actually the co-director of the Evolution Institute, and he's going to give an overview. So we'll start off with David.
Thank you very much. We had a very exciting time at the workshop, and I'm so happy to be able to share this with a larger audience. So here's something we all know. All of us have seen the dreary facts about the large fraction of Americans that claim to disbelieve the theory of evolution. But for me, this is not the most disturbing fact about public awareness of evolution. This is that almost 100% of people worldwide don't think about evolution in relation to matters of importance in their lives. For almost everyone, even those who accept evolution, it's about dinosaurs and human origins and fossils. And don't get me wrong, these are wonderful, wonderful things. Studying evolution in the biological realm is just fabulously interesting and important and entertaining. But what it leaves out is the tremendous relevance of evolutionary thinking for understanding and improving the human condition. That's what's new, and that's what's worldwide, not restricted to America. And so here are some levels of time, basically, that are so important for understanding the way we are now. First, there's our deep past, and despite the fact that we're such a special species, in many other respects we are just a species, and we have the heritage of our mammalian, our primate, mammalian, vertebrate, and even earlier heritage. And if you've read the wonderful book by Neil Shubin, Our Inner Fish, you know how much we need to understand the deep past in order to understand ourselves today. Then we have the merely deep past, our 6 million year history as a hominid on the African savanna, which shaped our bodies and our minds for a certain environment. And this was the environment that existed only until a few thousand years ago, really. So if you're an evolutionist, you know that, the only way to understand organisms is in relation to their environment. And this was our environment for a long, long time. We need to know about that in order to know how we behave today, even though, to some extent, we've evolved genetically since then. Genetic evolution, one of the big discoveries, actually, very recent discoveries, is that genetic evolution is a much faster process than we thought. It's been speeding up, not slowing down. But still, many of our aspects of our bodies and our minds are shaped by this environment, not our present environment. Then we have our cultural past, and more we're thinking about cultural change in the context of evolution. That cultural change is an evolutionary process, and that cultural diversity is fundamentally like biological diversity. So when we examine the many hundreds of cultures, many thousands of cultures that have existed past and present, the same toolkit that we use as biologists to study the differences between species and biological diversity can be used to study cultural diversity. And many of you have probably read this wonderful book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Then we have our individual past. Not just us, but all mammals have amazingly sophisticated adaptations which cause us to assess our environments in utero and to alter our bodies, and as we will see, our minds throughout our lives. And more we're discovering, for example, the things that, ways that we behave and our work physiologically later in life and in adulthood are actually determined by what happens to us at the earliest stages of the life cycle. And the only way to understand this is to think of ourselves as biological organisms. And then we have our current environments. Just take any city, such as the city of Binghamton, where I live, and which I study from an evolutionary perspective. And the response of people to their environments, there's an intimate relationship between the psychology of of a person and where they live and their interactions in their neighborhoods. This can even be an instantaneous response. And so one aspect of all of this is that evolutionary thinking includes but goes beyond genetic evolution. There's more to evolution than genetic evolution. At its most general, evolution is any process of variation and selective retention, variation and selection, which causes things to exist out of many things that could exist. It causes only some of those things to exist based on this variation and selection process. And so that covers genetic evolution, cultural evolution, individual change, and neural development. And so these processes operate at vastly different spatial temporal scales, of course, and they differ in their details, absolutely. But through an amazing respect, they all can be understood as part of the same conceptual framework. So understanding that there's more to evolution than genetic evolution expands the domain of evolutionary thinking way beyond where we're customarily thinking. And so we want to use this way of thinking to make a difference in the real world. We are a very new institute. Jerry Lieberman, maybe you could just stand up, Jerry, I can introduce my other co-director there. Thank you very much. Jerry comes from a humanism tradition and is the president of the Humanists of Florida Association. He's been a social activist all of his life, and not so many years ago, he actually read my book, Evolution for Everyone, I'm proud to say, and he had the idea that if we want to take humanistic values and if we want to make progress with them scientifically, then we don't just need a humanist think tank, we need an evolutionary think tank, and that was the birth of the Evolution Institute. So we want to provide, for the first time, a conduit from the world of evolutionary science to the world of public policy formulation. Our first workshop, our first focal topic last year was on childhood education, early childhood education. Not how to teach evolution in schools, that's important, very important, but how do we use evolutionary thinking to teach all subjects in school. And you would be amazed at the insights that emerged from that workshop. And it was Bruce who was a participant in that workshop because he is a world-renowned developmental evolutionary psychologist. And the result of that workshop said, I want to do this in Arizona for risky adolescent behavior. And so here we are, almost exactly a year later, thanks to Bruce, the hard work of Bruce and the McClellan Institute. So we just had finished our exciting 2 days that we're going to report to you. And in less than 2 weeks from now, we'll have our third workshop on the nature of regulation. What can evolution tell us about the regulation of large-scale human social interactions? And if that's not the mother of all policy questions, what would be? And for all of these, if you're thinking, what's evolution got to do with it? And many of you are, or should be, because it's not obvious until you get into it. And then it becomes so very interesting. And so this is the last point I want to address, is that all of these major issues, such as childhood education, risky adolescent behavior, how to regulate our social interactions, so much concern and goodwill. Everyone wants to teach our kids well and to prevent them from damaging our teenagers from engaging in destructive behavior. So lots of concern and goodwill, lots of everyday experience. We're all steeped in it in our everyday lives, right? And we all have wisdom that we've derived from our everyday lives and in a non-academic sense. Lots of scientific research, lots of money, lots of attempts at intervention. I actually tried to dig up a political cartoon that I remember many years ago from Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. I thought I could get it on the web. What it shows is this kind of bum with a beer can standing directly in front of this huge cannon. And there's dollar bills just littering the whole ground and fluttering through the air. And the caption is, "You missed me." And so how is it that all of this effort and all of this goodwill ends up not leading to solutions? And how is it possible that a new theoretical perspective can succeed where previous efforts have failed? That's a very important question to answer. And the best way for me to address it in a very brief time is to give you one of my favorite passages from Darwin's autobiography, when he's looking back and when he was a young man and he took a field trip with Sedgwick, his professor. And they were going to a valley in Wales to look for fossils. But that was dumb, because this valley was scoured by glaciers and there wasn't any fossils at all. But there's lots of evidence for glaciers, but no fossils. And Darwin says, "We spent many hours in Cumidwal, examining all the rocks with extreme care, as Sedgwick was anxious to find fossils in them. But neither of us saw a trace of the wonderful glacial phenomena all around us. We did not notice the plainly scored rocks, the perched boulders, the lateral and terminal moraines. Yet these phenomena are so conspicuous that a house burnt down by fire did not tell its story more plainly than did this valley. If it had still been filled by a glacier, the phenomena would have been less distinct than they are now." And the reason I love this quote is because it reveals the need for a theory to see what is in front of our faces. If you don't have any theory at all, then the world is just a buzzing and disorienting confusion. If you have the wrong theory, then the good news is it organizes your perception. It gives you a plan, but it leads to dead-end solutions. If you have the right theory, then everything falls into place, and the evidence that before was invisible now is so plain that the glaciers might as well have been there. And so Darwin's problem was that he visited the valley before the theory of glaciation had been proposed. And so this accounts for geology before glaciation, before the theory of glaciation, and that's what Darwin did, or initiated for the biological world, a buzzing and disorganized confusion, which then over the course of the 20th century has been organized by evolutionary theory. This is what's taking place right now as we apply evolutionary theory to all things human, something which has only been gathering steam, a really serious and concerted effort over the last, believe it or not, 10 or 15 years. That's how new it is, and how we can apply this to a specific topic, such as risky adolescent behavior. And so what was so gratifying for me at the workshop was, and I presented these last two slides as my first talk at the workshop, and I was thinking to myself, is a transformation of the obvious going to take place during this workshop? And I think that I can report that at least for quite a few people, it did, and especially the practitioners at the workshop who do this for their lives and for their career, and so they know more about risky adolescent behavior than I certainly ever will. And yet, one of the people there, in the comments afterwards, at the end of wrapping up the workshop, we asked the practitioners, "What do you think? Did we reinvent the wheel? Are we wrong? Does this make any sense?" And one of them said this: As someone who works in this day in and day out, he had been going about it, and this is the quote, never once thinking of the obvious, what's in it for the kids. And now I think that Bruce and the participants who have remained for this event will now, in a much shorter time, and I hope that we can do it because over 2 days it unraveled, it developed very nicely, and we'll see if we can somehow communicate this to you, why this is new and so very interesting for you during this event. So, Bruce, you want to? All right.
Okay, I'm going to start over here. So David just did a very nice job of both introducing some of the principles of evolutionary biology that are relevant to this process, but also he did a great job of introducing the Evolution Institute. And what I want to emphasize is that what happened over the last 2 days was really a partnership. It was a joint endeavor between the Evolution Institute and the Francis McClellan Institute. And I just want to recognize the input and the people from the Francis McClellan Institute. So we have our director here, Stephen Russell. I'm going to wave, Stephen. And we have the director of the Norton School, Soyan Shim. And we have the director of Cooperative Extension, Lynn Borden, here. She didn't expect. And we have as well as our program coordinator, Carmen Chan, and who actually did all the work to make this happen. So all of these individuals spent the entire weekend with us trying to hammer this out. So we were just really pleased to have them there, and it was really a unique opportunity to try to find a kind of conjunction between perspectives and a conjunction between people from very different backgrounds. Now, David, in his introduction, talked about, he showed you the quote from Darwin's autobiography about him not seeing the glacial valleys. And what I'm going to suggest is not that an absence of an evolutionary perspective has, in some sense, led people to do the wrong thing or to miss out, but that using an evolutionary perspective, really explicitly incorporating this perspective into the study of adolescent behavior might allow you to see some of those glacial valleys that you might be missing. It might lead to some new insights and some new ways of thinking and maybe a basic shift in thinking. So let me start off with a question. Why are adolescents so different from each other? Now, this is a picture of a 5th grade class. And one of the things that you look at when you look at a 5th grade class is how different the kids are from each other just in their physical development. One of the women in that young row has already completed puberty. She looks like a small version of a young adult. Other kids haven't even begun that process yet. They look dramatically different. But kids don't just differ on how fast they grow up or when they grow up. They differ on risky behavior, which is the topic of this symposium. They differ in social activities and civic engagement. And can evolution help us to understand why those differences exist, and can it help us to understand how to deal with differences, particularly in risky behavior? Well, to try to answer that question as to why are adolescents so different from each other, I'm going to start off by asking, why are caterpillars so different from each other? Okay, a little bit more simple example. Now you notice here that this is the Arizona caterpillar. And I chose the Arizona caterpillar because I just wanted to show that I'm one of you. This is not the Wisconsin caterpillar or the California caterpillar. This is the Arizona caterpillar. And what you see here are actually 2 full siblings. These are 2 caterpillars that are full siblings, and yet they look completely different. And why, why is that? The one on the left was born in the springtime, and it shows the spring morph or the spring form. It eats a diet of catkins, and it grows up to look just like that spring drooping flower. And the one on the right is actually born in the summertime, and it had a low-carb summer diet, and it grew up to look just like that twig. Now, it's not that you are what you eat. It's not like if one of these caterpillars ate a banana, it would look like a banana. But rather, there's 2 forms that it can take. It can take this spring form, and it can take this summer form. And it depends completely on its experiences in the first 3 days of life. And depending on what happens in those first 3 days, that is what it eats, it develops one form or another. And these forms are not arbitrary. The spring form is adaptive. It fits it to its environment. It helps it avoid being eaten by birds because it looks just like the spring flowers. And the summertime, that's adaptive too. So this is an example of how early experience shapes development in strategic ways. Now, what about humans? Can we think about humans as being kind of like caterpillars? Do children match development to the environments in which they live? And from an evolutionary perspective, the answer to that is yes. Children strategically match their development to function well in the environments in which they're growing up. So I want to make 4 points today, and the first one is about adaptive development. And this is thinking risky, we're all concerned about risky behaviors. We have attitudes towards risky behaviors, and we should be. Risky, dangerous, violent behaviors inflict huge costs on societies. But from an evolutionary perspective, risky behaviors reflect adaptations to risky environments, not necessarily deviations from optimal or normal development. And indeed, stressful environments have always been part of the human experience. They've always been part of our history. When you look at people living in small, pre-literate societies, hunting and gathering societies, the type of world that we lived in for more than 99% of our time on this planet, what you see is that half of the children that are born die before they grow up. We evolved in harsh environments that were rough on kids. And encountering stressful environments, what it does to children is it directs or regulates development towards social strategies that are adaptive under stressful conditions, even if those strategies are currently harmful or not what we want to see from a public policy perspective. Okay, and so thinking about this more broadly, in the worlds in which humans evolved, dangerous or unstable childhood environments meant a shorter lifespan. And when life is short, and the future is, and the cues around you are telling you the future is uncertain, our brains and bodies generally respond to this by growing up fast, by tending to live for the here and now, by going through early puberty. My own work in this area is about the role of family environments, harsh family environments, in accelerating puberty. Kids in this context, they tend to be more likely to engage in risky or violent competitive behavior or competition for status. They're more likely to engage in early and risky sex. And all of these things tend to increase the chance of reproducing and passing on one's genes in that particular dangerous or risky context. So you can think about so you can think about risky development just as you can think about positive or healthy development, both as being adaptations to different types of environments. Now, just starting off, what are the implications of this for policy and prevention? Well, first off, efforts to reduce the pain and suffering of adolescents growing up under adversity, and that's what so many of the people in this room are doing in their day-to-day lives and their work, need to take into consideration the local sense in which risky and seemingly self-destructive behaviors are adaptive. There are powerful evolutionary forces that lead people to show certain adaptations in contexts. And one needs to consider those powerful forces when you're trying to change those behaviors. Another fact to keep in mind when you consider adaptation in context is a lot of interventions are designed to make adolescents nicer people. They're designed to make them more pro-social, to reduce violent behavior, to reduce coercion, to reduce bullying, and those are all laudable goals. But we also have to be aware of the problem of declawing the cat. That is, these behaviors are often adaptations to harsh and risky environments. And when you change it, and when you change adolescents, when you declaw the cat and you release them back into that environment, it may have unknown consequences for them in terms of perhaps making them also more vulnerable to the context in which they live. Okay, second point I want to talk about is the adolescent brain. What is really going on in adolescence? What is the key thing happening in adolescence? And adolescence is a time of transformation of the brain. We all can see the radical changes of the body that happen in puberty, but those changes are relatively small compared to the fundamental changes that are happening in the brain at this time. These are puberty-specific changes in emotion, motivation, and behavior. And in conjunction with these changes, you see a variety of changes in adolescent behavior. You see an acceleration of strong feelings to high and sustained levels. What's sometimes referred to as igniting passions. Risk-taking, novelty, sensation-seeking, reward-seeking, all these things that involve seeking out high stimulation experiences, whether it's riding on a roller coaster or seeking out other types of high stimulation experiences. Sexual and romantic motivation dramatically increase. Concern with status and reputation among peers increases. As any of you who have adolescents know, and I have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, they become more resistant at this time to parental advice and information. There's also an intensification of peer relationships and influence. Now, given those goals, given those motives, given the things that are becoming important and relative to adolescence, you have to think about the question of what's in it for adolescents when you start thinking about interventions. Adolescents engage in a variety of strategies to control resources and achieve goals. And these range from pro-social and cooperative strategies to risky and dangerous strategies to strategies that are downright violent and coercive. But all of these strategies are fundamentally instrumental. None of them are being done arbitrarily. They all do things in different ways that achieve goals for adolescents. Drug use often increases reputation among peers. Gang membership is known to dramatically increase access to girlfriends for boys. Just as pro-social things like forming friendships provide support and protection. Both these things that we think of as pro-social and anti-social are achieving goals and doing things for adolescents. Now, interventions, from this perspective, interventions are very likely to fail if they subvert adolescent motives and goals. The abstinence only was an example of an intervention that was not very successful in terms of outcomes for adolescents. But thinking about goals, adolescents, what we need to do is develop interventions that find pro-social alternatives for adolescents to achieve these same goals. So, for instance, when you think of the topic of bullying, okay, bullying is an extreme problem. And bullying inflicts huge costs on other children. So what are bullies getting? What is bullying doing? What is bullying about? Children often bully, or adolescents often bully, to increase their own status and reputation among peers. They often bully as a way because it enhances their position in the group. It enhances their status. Now, if an intervention attempts to tell an adolescent that status isn't important, and we're trying just to tell the adolescent, don't bully, and that's the end of it, it's not going to work because we're doing something that's subverting that person's goal. So from this perspective, you need to think about alternatives. So for instance, let's say someone is a senior in high school, and they're bullying a 10th grader. Well, bullying a 10th grader, that's getting them power, that's getting them status among their peers, but maybe we could tell them, well, if instead of bullying that 10th grader, what if instead you took the role of a hero and you stopped a 12th grader from bullying another 10th grader? Well, then, you could gain more status among your peers because you stood up to a 12th grader rather than a 10th grader, at the same time doing something pro-social. So we really need to start thinking in this way of what is in it for the adolescent, what are their goals, and how can we reshape interventions to meet those goals, but at the same time move them towards more pro-social strategies. And finally here, we need to understand, in another way of saying, we need to understand the benefits of high-risk behaviors. So simple, what a lot of interventions do is just promotion of risk avoidance. We just try to teach risk-avoidant behaviors. And simple risk avoidance is inadequate if it just has the effect of subverting the goals that are important to adolescents at this time in brain development. Okay, a third point. Evolution produces many different kinds of people who can succeed in different ways. So we all notice individual differences. We all notice how different adolescents are from each other. Those differences are not an accident. Human diversity is part of the product of evolution, and it produces diversity in all kinds of ways. And one of the important differences between adolescents is simply in their openness or susceptibility to environments and life experiences. So the Swedish have an expression, a Swedish expression. I don't know how this word is pronounced. Do we have any Swedish speakers here? But it looks like it says maskrobarn. And maskrobarn means a dandelion child. And a dandelion child, in the Swedish lexicon is referring to a child who we sometimes refer to as resilient. This is a child who, good parenting, bad parenting, high quality schools, low quality schools, they seem to be able to show fairly equal outcomes across conditions. This is a child who is not very sensitive to or reactive to small variations in their environment. My best friend in high school was like this. His name was Bob. And I used to say Bob is Bob wherever Bob is, because he was relatively impenetrable. Now, other kids are more like orchids. We call them orchid childs. They're more like hothouse flowers. They're very sensitive to differences in their environment. Given a supportive, enriched environment, they can develop into to follow the analogy, a flower of unusual delicacy, a beautiful orchid, something they can really have dramatically, positive outcomes. But at the same time, under neglectful conditions, orchids tend to wilt and do poorly. Now, as the science advances, we are getting closer to being able to identify these more and less susceptible kids reliably. And a very hot area in developmental psychology is trying to understand this at the genetic level, trying to understand differences between these kids in their stress physiology, in their temperament. And we're probably 5 or 10 years away from really being able to identify clearly which kids are more susceptible to the day-to-day experiences in their lives. Now, this really has dramatic implications for interventions, because it clearly suggests that one size does not fit all. For the dandelion child, it may really be, for a dandelion child, it may not really be about trying to change the environment around them, because they may not be very, very sensitive to that environment. For dandelion children, what may be really important is promoting a rich array of niches and assisting youth in finding valued, rewarding places. So in a sense, for children like this, it's really helping them find the right environment, helping them find the right niche that can significantly enhance their outcomes and reduce problem behaviors. For other kids, for orchid childs, who are quite sensitive to variation in their lives, prevention interventions might really focus on changing their environments, and these changes are much more likely to produce sustained developmental change. So interventions are expensive. Interventions often, some interventions cost as much as $60,000 per kid. That's the fast track intervention, for instance. And thinking about who are we going to spend that money on, what's going to be cost effective, when we start talking about that kind of investment, we need to start thinking about, which kids can benefit from different kinds of different kinds of interventions and investments. Okay, finally, just a point that is highlighted from an evolutionary perspective is that during human evolution, there was no such thing as age segregation of kids. We never put, 30 third graders together in a classroom. Kids were always learning in an environment where younger kids were exposed to older kids, and older kids were exposed to younger kids. So throughout our history, until recent times, adolescents were never segregated. They grew up playing with and helping to care for younger children. Adolescent boys as well as girls enjoy much younger kids. They read to them, they give them piggyback rides, they do rough and tumble play with them, especially boys. They help them solve various practical problems. And there's evidence that regular exposure to younger kids draws out and exercises the nurturing side of adolescence, and also makes them even more nurturing in their interactions with other adolescents as well. And what happens when we put kids together in same-sex settings? What happens when we create a middle school that has 500 12-year-olds in it all crammed together? Well, that kind of age segregation increases competitiveness. It maximizes competitiveness among kids. And it maximizes cruel behavior, and the kind of things, and the kind of bullying that we're all worried about, and the kind of indirect aggression. And from an evolutionary perspective, this type of setting is clearly not natural. It's not natural in the sense that we have no precedent for it in our history. And it may itself induce behavioral and mental health problems in children. So again, just thinking about, from an evolutionary perspective, the context in which adolescents lived and developed is extremely important. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is actually invite the participants from the workshop. We have some of the participants here to kind of come up to the stage up here. If you could just, if Patty and Tony, if you guys could go and take your seats up, at the AJ. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of these participants to say a couple words introducing themselves and maybe share a couple reactions, and then we're going to open this up to community roundtable, a general community discussion. Okay. So, Patty, do you want to start and just kind of say who you are and kind of what your perspective is?
Patty, you might want to get the microphone a little closer to you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. I'm Pat Hawley. I'm a professor of child development at the University of Kansas. And what I've been spending the last 10 or 11 years doing is looking at the central organizing role that power relationships play in human social organization. And how I've translated that is I've looked at the role that positive behaviors play across the lifespan in maintaining those power relations. And I've done this in toddlers in Germany and preschoolers in Kansas and Connecticut, and adolescents in Kansas, and even in adults. And one of our goals is to look at some of the outcomes associated with these power relations and the positive behaviors that parlay into them in terms of social relationships, well-being, and health. And on the flip side, however, and I presume this is why I was invited to this wonderful workshop, is that I'm rethinking aggression and aggression's role in maintaining power relationships in human social groups. And I have found that aggression under certain circumstances and in certain contexts actually feeds well into human social competence, and we tend to call these people very effective leaders. A second goal that I have at the University of Kansas is that I'm employing David Wilson's goals in terms of broadening evolutionary thinking in terms of another way of knowing to the students of Kansas to add to their arsenal just to bolster their scientific thinking in addition to their other ways of knowing as well.
Good morning. I'm Mark Flynn. I'm a medical anthropologist, a professor at the University of Missouri. For the last 21 years, I've been doing research in a small community on the island of Dominica. And my research involves collecting saliva from children. I'm known as Dr. Quasha, which is the word for spit in patois. The reason why I collect saliva is because we can monitor hormone levels from the saliva. And I've been especially interested in stress hormones and some of the reproductive hormones that are particularly important in transitions in adolescence. And I'm also becoming very interested in the affiliative hormones that underpin the addiction that we have for our relatives. I'm also a father, and I have 3 sons, and I dearly love them. I'm severely addicted to my children. And there's a neurochemical basis for that love that I have for my children. And we're very interested in seeing what the circumstances are that in which these close relationships in the family develop and what the variability of those relationships is. So in terms of my role in this bigger workshop trying to understand adolescent risk behavior, I'm sort of the mechanic in that I can help provide some information about the mechanisms that are involved in these changes and how things like social support, loving grandmothers, those kinds of things, how they translate into different behaviors that we see in adolescence. I've really enjoyed being in Tucson. It's a beautiful place. Thank you all.
My name's Tony Volk. I'm a child psychologist from Brock University, which is in Niagara Falls, Canada. I'm interested in parenting, and I'm also interested in bullying. And what I'm interested in bullying is looking at it from an evolutionary and cultural, historical viewpoint. And so the main themes that I think that I wanted to bring to this workshop was, first of all, bullying is a really ancient behavior. We see it in all kinds of other animals. We see it in all human societies going back in time. So for children engaging in bullying, this is a really long-term history behind it. So what I kind of think of that as is it's got a really strong gravity. As children develop and they're pulled in different directions towards different behavior, worldwide, bullying seems to have the power to attract children to use it. And they use it because it's useful. It's useful in helping them reach their goals, whether that's status in our schools, whether it's getting the last piece of food in a desperate, starving village, or whether it's bullying children in another group in order to increase the solidarity of your own group. So reinforcing the insiders versus outsiders. And what I want to do from there is develop interventions that, as Bruce mentioned, don't simply take away the behavior without giving them a tool to do the same thing in a pro-social way. When we have zero tolerance, we have the program in Canada as well as here in the United States. We say, we will not tolerate bullying. Well, that's great, but what are we giving them in replacement? We say, you can't do this to meet those important goals, and then we walk away and we expect them to listen. Okay? They don't. So instead, what we want to do is find meaningful alternatives. Bruce gave a nice example of standing up for children as a way to get status, incorporating other children to build your size of your groups, and then lastly, to challenge ourselves as adults so that we change the culture that children are living in, so that we no longer excuse bullying as a rite of passage, as something that children need to go through or that it's fine and has no consequences. So that instead of expecting children to be the agents of social change, we recognize that in many ways adolescents are sponges of culture. And if we don't change the way we culture our children, then we're setting them up to gravitate towards these bad behaviors. Thank you.
I'm A.J. Figueredo, and many of you here already know me because I've been a professor at the University of Arizona for 22 years now, since 1987. I currently serve as director of the Ethology and Evolutionary Psychology program within our brand new School of Mind, Brain, and Behavior that we just started in July. And I was trained way back when as, that's better, okay. As an animal behaviorist, I mostly worked on the evolution and behavioral development of insects, birds, and primates, and I've slowly worked my way up on us primates here, the humans. One of the things that has attracted my interest, and I've been working more on with my colleagues in my laboratory here, is something called life history theory, okay, which is the development of an individual differences that manifest themselves throughout the lifespan, okay. One of my contributions to this current conference has been an analysis of the behavioral ecology of risk. And after studying these various issues in both human and non-human animals, I was struck by the fact that within psychology, risk is a bad word, right? Risk is bad, right? When you heard about these adolescent risk behaviors, you probably thought of all kinds of bad things, didn't you? You weren't thinking of good things. But the point is that all of us take risks. Life is full of risks. Most of us take calculated risks, expecting to gain some kind of rational benefit. You can't start a business. You can't run for office. You can't hold a press conference without some degree of risk. That's part of life. And we can't look upon it in this way that it's a bad thing. We have to understand, as many of my colleagues have said, what are the motivations? What are the potential benefits that these adolescents and we ourselves are trying to gain from this risk-taking, and how can it be managed to be more rational, to be more productive, and to lead to positive outcomes? Okay, so I'm not saying, yeah, go for it, let them take the risks. I'm saying, obviously, I have kids too. You know, we don't want them to just take weird risks, right? But we can't just condemn it and say risk is bad, because most of us would not be able to function on a day-to-day basis if we didn't take some kind of risk for some expected benefit. So an analysis of under what conditions people take more or less risks, what kind of risks they take, why are they doing it? That's really important. And then try to address those needs and desires, right, in ways that are perhaps safer, environments that are more predictable, less harsh, less dangerous, right? The risk can be managed and channeled into something constructive. You know, a lot of our heroes in American society are big risk takers, right? All our heroes and pioneers and captains of industry and investors and inventors, Thomas Edison, all these people, right? They were big risk takers. Why aren't we addressing their problems? Well, because they weren't the problem, right? The problem is, you know, all the drugs and the violence and this kind of stuff, right? So what I wanted to do a little bit is rehabilitate the concept of risk, realize that we all do it, realize why we do it, and then furthermore, why these kids do it. If you don't address, as many of my colleagues have said, the reasons why they're doing this, you can't just say no, just stop that. You know, that's not good. You have to address, how can I get how can I fulfill my needs and desires and my development? You have to give them a way, right, in order to accomplish these goals. So, and that relates, of course, to their developmental conditions, their life history, and all kinds of things that you probably don't want to be bored with right now, but that's what I worry about all the time. So.
Okay, first off, thank you very much for those really insightful comments. I think what you've heard now is a pretty good summary of several of the main themes that were highlighted in this workshop. And what we would like to do now is just invite all the people that are here to make comments, ask questions. If you want to raise a question, you know, anyone up here might try to answer it or respond to it. The one thing I would ask is that if you could walk up to that microphone there so that people will be able to hear you when you ask your question, and so that we can hear you as well, or make your comments. So I'd like to, you know, you can just go ahead and invite anyone who'd like to give some input.
Good morning. My name is Allison Tibbles. I work at the Parent Connection, and I've not read the Fetal Matrix, but Dr. Spitt, I'd like to ask you a question. It's kind of two parts, but when you evaluate the spit, do you evaluate the spit of newborns? And is there kind of a measure of normalcy in newborns? And the reason I'm asking that is I worked for a long time with adolescent parents, and I'm not a professional in this area, but I think there's a great deal to be studied about in utero PTSD, and I'm wondering if newborns were tested, whether you could see in that actual moment of birth whether there's a normal stress at being born, or whether there was a hormonal shift somehow, and that knowing that, maybe we could address that immediately in that family in a different way. Thank you.
Any chance you'd be willing to come to graduate school to solve that problem?
Oh, God, yes, if someone would pay me.
You know, it's a brilliant question. I have a colleague, Pablo Nepomniachtchi, at Simon Fraser University, who monitors stress hormone levels during pregnancy and actually before pregnancy. And he is the world's expert in assessing the level of stress hormones in the fetus and in the mother and the dialogue between the two. I'm a little more partial to kids, and I also, you know, my top priority is never to sort of intervene invasively. So it's not until kids get to be about 3 or 4 months, at which point they're pretty happy to have the corners of their mouths dabbed with a cotton roll that we can then collect saliva with, that I come on the scene. So I can't answer your question, but if you email me, I'd be more than happy to send you to my friend Pablo's website where you could get some insight.
Is your information in the packet?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. I'm State Representative Daniel Patterson from here in Tucson. My district includes downtown, south side, southeast, and I salute you for doing this really fascinating work. I was struck by one of the comments that came up in the broader presentation about age separation really, quote, not being natural and a very recent phenomena in human evolution, specifically mentioning increasing competitiveness and cruelty, and there was the example given of middle schools. Has anybody looked at, as opposed to middle schools, things like kindergarten through 8th grade schools, and if the behavior is different, if it results in a better environment for kids? Because here in Tucson we have both models. We have some schools that go kindergarten to 8. Of course, everybody goes to high school, but then we have other schools that are segregated by middle school. So I guess I'll ask you, where would you put your kid? Would you put him in a K-8 school? Would you put him in a middle school? Or do you have enough evidence to really know where is the more healthy environment?
Yeah, this is a good example of a question that nobody thinks of asking unless you're much more likely to ask it when you're thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective. It's then that you go to other cultures, and especially hunter-gatherer cultures, and learn that although all cultures have much to learn, and I think arguably, even though our society is more complex than a hunter-gatherer society, individual hunter-gatherers have to learn more than we do because our civilization does so much for us. And so all cultures have a lot to learn, and yet there's very little resembling formal education. Almost no direct instruction of children by adults. And what happens is that it's so emergent. The kids go around in mixed age groups. The older kids are eager to be adults. They're eager to learn the values and the skills of their society, and the younger kids are eager to learn from older kids, and it just happens. So knowing that, we really want to know, how can we incorporate this into our own educational system? And as to the question, has anyone done a formal study of middle schools versus this is the kind of thing we want to know? And often what happens is, now that you have the question, you can scour the literature, and because so much has been done, and it might well be that there is a literature on this. I cannot tell you that in particular, but if not, then we have our next study that we want to do. And the person who's best known for this is named Peter Gray, and he writes a blog for Psychology Today if you want to learn more about this, and himself promotes a wonderful school called the Sudbury Valley School, which, without knowing it, converged upon the hunter-gatherer education style. And there's also something that was discussed in this workshop called Century Schools. Who was it that I think Dennis Embry, who isn't a participant who wasn't here, talked about the Century School system, which in its own way seems to converge upon hunter-gatherer or a traditional cultural form of education. So there's lots of different things to work on, and mixed age groups. I'm sorry to make this comment long. All of this applies outside of school in addition to inside of school. And another thing that's gone away is just free, unstructured play involving mixed age groups. So all of this structured play, but according to Peter, what we really need is to recreate, again, something which came for free in our own childhoods, when you simply got up and your parents said, go outside, and you met up with the neighbors. It was pretty safe. You have adults looking out for you and policing you so that if you misbehave, somebody else can call you mom and ground you. These are things that we're learning the benefits of these, and sometimes they go away and we don't understand what's gone away. And we are trying, so knowing this, we are trying intervention demonstration projects, basically, with clients and partners who have schools, as in your associate in Tampa, Florida, and in my city of Binghamton. And I would think what possibilities you have in Tucson with this excellent scientific expertise and the ideas emerging from this workshop, and all of the partners that were at the workshop and are now here in this room and elsewhere. I think anyone who wants to think about this and to employ it in their in their schools and neighborhoods. That's what we're attempting to do. And a point that I try to make for all of our workshops is that we don't have to do stuff in the laboratory for 5 years before it can be employed in the real world. Many of these things can be studied basically in the real world, both scientifically and as an intervention.
Good morning. My name is Will Creamer. I'm the director of Reach Out and Read Southern Arizona. And my question is, where are the adult role models? If all the pictures you showed in your slides about kids and risky behaviors, I kept wanting to see professional athletes, rap stars, hedge fund managers, all going for the quick goal, the esteem from their colleagues, the quick dollar, the headline in the paper, everything so instant that what an adolescent sees around, why would there be a sense of a delayed gratification or a sense of a more mature, thoughtful response? Why wouldn't an adolescent just assume, hey, let's grab it while we can, everybody else is? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question. You know, from this perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, the way that we think of children is that their brains are designed to monitor their environment, to monitor important resources and supports in their environment, the way those caterpillars monitored what they were eating. And so in some contexts, you'd expect that children are going to develop in a way where they're going to have a short-term orientation. They're going to try to get it while they can, and particularly if they're growing up in contexts where there are signals around them that life is short. Maybe they attended the funeral of some of their adolescent friends while they were growing up, and maybe their grandfathers were dead before they were born, and maybe they live in a world where there's all kinds of cues around them that which are shifting in that way. And so in that context, and one of the lessons from this is that we can predict development in that context. We know reliably what the brain and body are doing in that context. On the other hand, children that are given more supportive, predictable environments, children who are exposed to consistent parenting and have a more stable home environment and have more stability of resources are much more likely to develop a pro-social orientation and are much more likely to develop mutually, reciprocally rewarding interpersonal styles, more likely to delay sex and to pursue longer-term goals like going to college. So this is, these are the facts on the ground. And so what we were trying to do in this workshop is think about what can we do with those facts on the ground, and how can we better intervene with kids, particularly kids that are in that high risk path, and how can we give them alternative paths that still meet their needs?
Yeah, I think, go ahead. And I want to say something.
Yeah, just a brief anecdote. I've been working in this village, and the change over the 2 decades I've been there. 20 years ago, if you asked children who their heroes were, who they respected, it was their hardworking grandparents that they worked side by side with. And, the transition, just like you described it so beautifully, when you get a different set of role models that the media is pushing you. So it would be wonderful if we could develop programs that would help grandparents and parents, other relatives, recapture some of the influence to become heroes again for our youth.
Yeah, a misconception that we're always fighting at the Evolution Institute is that we have biology and evolution over here, and we have learning and culture over there, which we don't need to think about from an evolutionary perspective. And the real situation is that these are much more integrated with each other. And in particular, what's happening is that the norms of a society are very much structuring what's going on. And there's kind of good news and bad news associated with that. Some of the successful intervention programs at scales both small and large involve basically shaping the norms of what we should and shouldn't do in a way that's sufficiently meaningful. Why is it that there's other societies out there, especially Scandinavian countries, for example, in which they're systemically different in a way that makes them work better, frankly, in some ways. So an important message here is that we need to think in scales both large and small. everything in the workshop, we talked about everything from coaching individuals, learning a lot about them as individuals in relation to their immediate social environment, as that being something useful, all the way to thinking about the deep structure of the different societies that we have.
Good morning. I'm Steve Lynn, and I chair the State Early Childhood Development and Health Board for the state of Arizona, dealing with children 0 to 5. Following up on Representative Patterson's question, just a comment first and then a question. The comment first is when my children were growing up in a very structured environment in terms of school, the age-appropriate environment that you spoke of, they had something that was overarching, and that was in the neighborhood. There was a neighborhood swim team, and the swim team had children from age 6 through 18, and it provided the very kind of intergenerational or inter-age pattern that you spoke of, where it made the neighborhood more safe, made the neighborhood more caring one for the other, and it meant that young children who went to participate always had somebody at a middle school or a high school that they knew by name, by face, by association, and it made it a much richer environment for them to grow up. So there are patterns that you could study without artificially creating them, where these overlay neighborhoods and school patterns. Just a comment. The question is as follows. Necessarily to deal with this issue, you have to categorize behaviors as risky or non-risky behavior. And for those behaviors that you've categorized as risky behavior, is there always a pro-social alternative, or in some cases, is the behavior so inherently fulfilling that it can't be substituted? In other words, I can think of some examples where children might use drugs to self-medicate for reasons other than just experimentation. In other cases, they're simply experimenting and expect the result they're going to get. Is there something you then can substitute for that experimentation that is more pro-social, or are there some that are simply bound to happen?
Tony, do you want to? I think one of the advantages of using an evolutionary perspective is that it reframes that question. The behavior is not the end. It's a means to an end, and you're kind of elaborating to that. So the child who's using drugs and getting an incredible artificial rush of these neurochemicals, so dopamine, for example, is doing it for an end. They're doing it because they're seeking a thrill, and there's other more pro-social ways of getting thrills. You can win championships, you can go out on a great date, you can engage in riskier but safer sporting activities to get these areas. If they're doing it to self-medicate, that's a great example of the child using a risky behavior to actually meet a pro-social end, to feel better about themselves. And in that case, you really do want to step in and give them tools to do that in a safer way and a better way. And some of this can involve having the right cultural support so that these children are aware of these alternatives. But it's recognizing that the drug use isn't the problem. I mean, this is not unique to evolutionary theory, but drug use in and of itself isn't typically the reason why adolescents are doing it. They're doing it for a thrill, or they're doing it to fit in with the rest of the group who's doing it, or they're doing it to self-medicate because they have problems at home or at school. And if we don't focus on solving those problems, what you end up doing is just keep slapping on new Band-Aids, new expensive Band-Aids to cover up the new problems without ever addressing the underlying cause.
One more comment I'd like to make about that. There was actually a debate a long time ago. Occasion, you know, my original field, as I said, was animal behavior, and there was this very famous animal behaviorist, Conrad Lawrence, many of you may have heard of him, who believed that there was a certain amount of aggressive impulse that people had, and animals too. And this aggressive impulse built up in you and had to be dissipated. And the threshold for releasing that aggression just kept on going down and down and down as you didn't behave aggressively. And then all came out in a flood when you finally did. Many of us have this kind of common sense notion, it's in the popular culture, you know, that we have this certain drive for aggression, that we must let it out in one way or another. Okay. Now, some people at the time took serious issue with that. For example, the famous behavioral psychologist Edward Tolman wrote this whole book against that view entitled Drives Towards War that said the same thing that my colleague Tony just said, that this is not true. This has actually never been proven. There has never been any evidence that we build up some kind of aggressive impulse that has to be dissipated. Instead, aggression is instrumental. It is a means to an end. And if you give people or animals another way to achieve their objectives, aggression is not even necessary. And you know, there were all these theories in the 60s about repression and how you'll have to let it out and repression is bad. This is nonsense. This is not true. It never was true. And there was never any evidence for it. Okay? So that we have to realize that most of these problem behaviors are instrumental and they can be circumvented, and there is no need for these things to happen. It's not like it's going to happen anyway. It's not inevitable. There is no drive for that. There's drive for goals that all of us have. All of us want friendship, status, wealth, love, you name it. This is what people want. They don't want aggression. They don't want drugs. Nobody has an instinct for that. That didn't even exist in our ancestral past.
Hi, I'm Craig LaCroix. I have actually a similar follow-up question along those same lines. Because a part, when you're using like the bullying as an example, and people are saying, well, you need to come up with a substitute. So my question is, I mean, what is the evidence that substitutes will work, and how will you know consistently what really is a substitute? Because it sounds like, it sounds like a good idea in the abstraction, but, consistently, if we're going to develop interventions, we're going to have to know what will actually substitute that will make a difference. Do we really have that knowledge at this point, and how can we build interventions to utilize that kind of information?
The short answer is we don't have that data yet. That's something that my colleagues and I are working on right now. One of the really tricky things about bullying is that it's not a homogeneous form. There's not one kind of bullying. Physically hitting or yelling at somebody face-to-face is very different from spreading rumors about them and sabotaging their reputation, not inviting them to a party, which is very different from having racial or ethnic or religious discrimination, which is different from sexual bullying, where you sexually harass members of the same or opposite sex. So right there you have a wide range of different kinds of bullying that require different kinds of interventions. Then you have children who are engaging them in different reasons. Children who have poor impulse control, children who have long-term strategic goals, adolescents, I should say, instead of just children. And what we're doing is we're starting at a small sample level and working with individual children. And what we do is we look at the strengths of a child. So if a child, for example, has really good empathy skills, but has really poor emotional control. So these are your childs who tend to act really reactively. What we want to do with that child, and what we've started doing with some of these children, these adolescents, they're about range from 14 to 18, is we say when you're feeling upset, quickly blurt out the first nice thing that comes to your head. That's what they're good at. Okay? They're good at blurting things out. They're not good at stopping, counting to 10, and breathing. So when they quickly blurt out that positive thing, it usually disrupts the whole negative cycle. And in those cases, it seems to be working. When we have children on the other end of the spectrum, children who are very low on empathy but are good at controlling their emotions, we can use the opposite effect and say, think things through, and kind of the example that Bruce gave, that when you are in one of these situations, your goal is to get status. You can stop and think through about more pro-social ways. We don't try to teach them empathy skills if that's a problem that they've had for 16, 17 years. You're fighting upstream. Instead, we work with their natural and developmental talents that they have. How can we do this at a larger scale? The answer is it's really tough, okay? Because we're talking about individual children. And in a sense, that's intuitive, I think, to what a lot of people know. There really aren't very good Band-Aid solutions that apply to every child. If you're doing an intervention, I wish I had a magic bullet that said, say, XYZ to any child, there goes bullying. The other thing that we're doing on top of this, because that's really intensive, is we're trying to change the social attitudes that we have as adults. As I've mentioned, as David mentioned, we implicitly encourage aggression. We talked about role models and the importance of role models, but let's not forget the importance of role models of parents. How many parents here have driven aggressively? with their children? How many parents have talked about how they beat somebody out for a promotion at work? How many people have been to, in Canada, we call them the hockey parents, football parents or baseball parents down here who are yelling at the children on the field to, go ahead and score. My daughter, when she was 5, was playing soccer, and one of the parents on the other team, best boy on the field, had the ball, was dribbling the ball, and his parents were yelling, "Don't pass the ball. You're the best child there. Score yourself." Okay? They were right, and he did, but what kind of example is that setting? And I think when we're talking about interventions, the way I look at it is we have 2 levels. We've got these expensive, intensive, effective, but individualized programs. But at a broader level, I think the bigger way to make change is to change the environment for all children so that these aggressive rewards go away. And that means that bullying may still happen at some level, but it's inherently less advantageous. So when a child is thinking, what am I going to do for status? What am I going to do for lunch money? Bullying comes with a really high cost because society says we don't like it. The other children say we don't like it. The parents, when they hear about it, don't say, it's just kids being kids. So I think we need those 2 levels of intensive as well as cultural bullying, and we're getting data on those as we speak.
If I can add something to what my colleague Tony has already explained about bullying behavior and some of the social ecology, is that what the evolutionary perspective adds for me is a reminder that an individual is always embedded in an environmental context, and that some fruitful bullying interventions might be to explicitly recognize the layers of socio-ecological context in which the child finds themselves. Of course, this isn't unique to the evolutionary perspective, but those of you who remember your intro child psych class might remember the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who talked about ecological systems theories, and remember that big diagram with the circles. What I'm getting at is there's actually some very effective bullying intervention programs already going on that are absolutely cutting edge in Finland by my colleague Christina Salmavalli. And what she's recognized is it is less effective to focus on the individual, but to go ahead and to attack the entire socio-ecology that the child finds himself in. And this not only includes the parents and teachers, which Tony already talked about, but also the other children. Because as the question urged us to think about, how can we replace bullying behavior with another behavior, there's a ton of other behaviors going on in that socio-ecological context that also need to be replaced. And that is the passivity of the other children who are witnessing the bullying act, or the egging on, or the reinforcement, or the high fives. And so what Dr. Salmavalli has done is she is explicitly going into these school contexts, training teachers to help train all of the children to empower themselves to intervene, to step over that little obstacle to say, hey, we won't tolerate this behavior and I will intervene, because a lot of the bullying context is the audience effects. And so she's going in there after the audience effects, and she's having amazing results.
To elaborate on that, I think a meta message which emerges from so much of this is that, and this is, evolution is fundamentally about the relationship between organisms and their environment. And so if you want to change the behavior of an organism, you need to change the environment, basically, so that the behaviors that you are trying to favor are the ones that win the Darwinian contest within that kind of environment. But this kind of environmental change might seem daunting. In some cases it is daunting. In other cases it's not so daunting. And among the programs discussed during the workshop are ones that can be very easily implemented in classrooms. For example, the good behavior game that's promoted by Dennis Embry and the Paxos Institute right here in Tucson, Arizona. And when you see how these things work, then there's these basic building blocks that are a part of that come for free in small-scale society. They involve people establishing norms by consensus. That seems like such a no-brainer, right? Except it doesn't happen in a school, which is typically authoritarian, and the kids are told what to do. It's in their best interest, and so the kids feel jerked around because it's not their decision. And if you then ask the kids to make their decision as to what the do's and the don'ts should be, they come to the same things that you do, but they made the decision. And then if you split them into groups, and then if you have the groups compete to be good, then you turn peer pressure in the direction of good behavior, not bad behavior. And there's all kinds of bells and whistles that can be employed and work, and have been shown to work. So this is, I think, an optimistic conclusion that although there's lots left to try, and there's change at the large scale, which is going to be daunting for sure, there's also, as someone has already said, there's stuff out there that works, and so we want to promote those.
Well, I would like to, oh, do we have another question? One more.
Yeah,
Is there time?
I think this will be our last question.
Thank you. My name is Dan McDonald. I'm an agent with Cooperative Extension here in Pima County. I was an observer of the Institute, and I thank you very much for inviting me to be part of that. It was fascinating. One of the things that I do with Cooperative Extension is supervise a nutrition education program here in the county, and one of the audiences that we work with are teen moms or pregnant teens, young mothers, trying to get them to eat well and so forth. One of the things we're up against are advertisers, who I think have this evolutionary thinking down pat. I mean, they really know what we as humans are craving. So we're up against those means to an end, you know, some high sugar energy food that somebody wants. So what is the, you know, what do I tell that adolescent mom about what's in it for her in terms of good health and good nutrition, not just for herself, but for her child? And how do I counter what the other messages are that through advertisers? I know you're just starting this, you may not have the answers, but what suggestions might you have? Because we've talked a lot about bullying and some other things, but this is a true risk that you know, young women, young men, and others, of course, are up against. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's an excellent question. And you certainly hit it on the nose when you said that advertisers understand what's going on. You know, one of the obstacles that you face with nutrition education and nutrition programs is that part of the human fruit-eating adaptation is having a sweet tooth. And a sweet tooth is something that was always adaptive throughout our evolutionary history because it led us to eat and seek out ripe, healthy fruit. There was no refined sugar in our environment. Now, you know, in recent history, we have refined sugar, and we all of a sudden are inundated with chocolate milkshakes and chocolate cakes and all these intensely sweet foods. And the problem is that this is an environmental mismatch, that our brains are designed to seek out and want to eat sugar because it was always something that was scarce and healthy in our environment. And if at once upon a time it maximized fitness, now it's just maximizing obesity and heart disease. So we are really, you know, facing a mountain because of, you know, somewhere along the line in human invention, we process sugar and there's no turning back. So in terms of, you know, what you can do about that, I wish that I had an answer. And it's not just sugar. It's not just that, I mean, it's not just, you know, addiction to high sugar foods and bad diet. It's all kinds of things. It's like throughout our evolutionary history, when we saw an attractive member of the opposite sex, we often had activated certain dopamine reward, you know, mediated centers in the brain that led us to seek out a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship. But now we have, you know, internet pornography that people have very few defenses against also. So there's all kinds of things that are just, there's all kinds of new aspects of our environment where people are trying to sell us things that are maximally kind of juicing our brain mechanisms that we just, you know, we haven't evolved adequate defenses against them yet. So I don't know if any of the other panelists want to suggest I mean, I'm just kind of rephrasing the problem. I don't know if anyone want to suggest a particular answer to that problem.
Yeah, I think Mark, yeah, let's, Mark, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, we do like our sugars and fats and salt, but we also like our healthy babies. And so, one tactic is to tap into that component of our evolved psychology in an advertising scheme to demonstrate to mothers that, there are significant consequences for prenatal nutrition, and see where you can go with it. Hire the best advertising agency you can find.
I agree with Mark, and you could also point out we had a commercial that I've seen before and that was played during the conference. You may have seen it, the little boy, it's in French, screaming he wants his candy, and he's throwing things around on the ground, and he's just having a temper tantrum, spinning around in the grocery store, ripping things off the shelves, and at the end it's an ad for condoms. Okay, so the idea that you want these parents, you're shocking teenagers into saying that you might be biting off more than you could chew if you're not careful. With children or with mothers and preteens, you could emphasize that you may end up having to do a lot more with a child if you don't eat well. If you don't eat well now, your life is going to change more than it will already. So you might be able to tap into other ways creatively. I agree, get the best darn advertiser you can afford, but tap into ways that appeal to adolescents, appeal to the motives that are sensitive to adolescents.
Yeah, I'd like to say, oh, sorry, Bruce.
Well, we just need to wrap up, but why don't you make a final?
Just a little bit more about mismatch, because evolutionary theory, I think, is well described as a toolkit, more than one important idea in evolutionary theory. An extremely important idea that's been stressed here is adaptation, the fact that when people do things, it's for a reason, and you have to take that into account. How simple is that? And yet that's often not taken into consideration in existing interventions. Another very important idea is mismatch, which is that any species which evolved in one environment is only adapted to that environment, and all bets are off when you put them in another environment. If you take a species, a lizard that evolved in the rainforest and put it in the desert, all bets are off. And so there's very important examples of dysfunction in human life, one of which is the dietary considerations that we've thought, and there's others. And a lot of these come from the fact that society is at such a larger scale. So in a small-scale society, if somebody does something successful, it's immediately noticed, compared, and copied. This comes for free in small-scale society. In large-scale society, something can be successful, and it doesn't spread, even though it deserves to. And so you have to build in the mechanisms of cultural evolution that come easily at a smaller scale. And there's many other examples of this. So mismatch is an important tool. Adaptation is an important tool, and there's more important tools in the toolkit that we're offering basically through the workshop.
Okay, well, first off, I just want to say thank you very much to our panelists for their excellent insights. And I just want to mention as we close here that this workshop was really not just a singular event in itself. It was really part of a process. And the goal of the Evolution Institute and the Francis McClellan Institute is to make the world a better place for children and to advance social policy. So we'll be continuing with many demonstration projects and many attempts to communicate the results of these findings, so stay tuned. And thank you all very much for coming.